My name is Phil Devlin. I am a retired English, Latin, and history teacher, taught for 34 years, and I have a great interest in the world wars of the 20th century. My father, six of my uncles, and an aunt were all in the war. I grew up on a little street in Windsor Locks called Cherry Street. There's only 16 houses on the street, and yet we had 12 World War veterans in 16 houses. I didn't realize how significant that was until well later on. I kind of thought it was the norm, but it isn't for sure. So let's get started. Pearl Harbor, the stories behind the story. Let's see if we can make this thing. It won't, Helen, it won't advance. We're trying to make it advance. Okay. Thank you. All right, so we're ready now. All right, so one of the things that people don't realize is that the Pearl Harbor attack was not as much of a surprise as most people think. And we can get a sense of that by looking at this quotation from Henry Stimson, who was Roosevelt's Secretary of War. In the fall of 1941, this is 3 months before the attack, let's see. He said, one would get the impression that the imminent threat of war in October and November of 41 was a deep secret known only to the authorities in Washington. Nothing could be further from the truth. The imminence of war with Japan was a matter of public knowledge. In the fall of 41, Japan occupied the Cam Ranh Naval Base, approximately 800 miles from Manila in the Philippines. The American retaliation for this included the seizing of all Japanese assets in the States and the closing of the Panama Canal to Japanese shipping. September of 41, Roosevelt issued a statement drafted by Churchill that threatened war between the United States and Japan should the Japanese encroach any further on territory in Southeast Asia or the South Pacific. So it's clear in the fall of 41 that there were big tensions there. Pearl Harbor wasn't Japan's only target, by the way. On that infamous day of December 7th, Japan also attacked Guam, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaya. Okay. Here's an excerpt from the Los Angeles Times dated the 8th of December of 1941, answering the question, why did they attack Pearl Harbor? The purpose of the Japanese in striking at Pearl Harbor is obvious. The vast area of the naval base, 1,735 acres, 250 buildings, and 15,000 linear feet of berthing space, is a natural target, as it is the most complete naval base owned by this country, the center of the Pacific Fleet operations, and possesses many vulnerable features which are well and easily recognized. Okay? There's a historical antecedent for this that few people are aware of. And the antecedent goes back to the Russo-Japanese War, a war that hardly anybody knows anything about these days. But it is a fascinating war. And we find the precedent for Pearl Harbor in this war, where Japan, a much smaller nation, defeated Russia, I should say thumped them in a very short period of time. And you'll see the parallels that exist with Pearl Harbor, which occurred 37 years later. And here it says, the unsuspecting Navy ships lay peaceably in their Pacific harbor that winter morning. A world away, the drowsy sailor's commander-in-chief had been negotiating with Japanese diplomats. But then, with no advance warning, Japan launched the infamous sneak attack. Deadly torpedoes and bombs came out of nowhere, and soon the harbor was a flaming mess of sunken ships. Screaming sailors swam for their lives through fiery, oil-blackened waters. President Roosevelt admired the sneak attack. I was thoroughly well pleased with the Japanese victory, the president wrote his son. Now, that's Teddy Roosevelt, not Franklin. And all of these parallels that sound just like Pearl Harbor in December of 41, this happened in the winter, just like Pearl Harbor attack did. And no advance warning, just like Pearl Harbor. But this is 1904.
Really works for me. Provision has been
February 8th, 1904, a Sunday. December 7th, 1941, a Sunday. The incident described as the Japanese sneak attack upon the Russians at Port Arthur, February 8th, 1904. This incident triggered the Russo-Japanese War in 04-05, a war in which a much smaller nation defeated a much larger nation. The Japanese defeated the Russians. This war featured the largest land battles involving hundreds of thousands of men the world had ever seen. These battles dwarfed Gettysburg. At the Battle of Mukden in February and March of 05,
You're okay. Your microphone and your camera are off.
modern warfare, the Japanese killed 97,000 Russians. At the naval battle of Tsushima 3 months later, the Japanese lost 600 while killing 6,000 Russians, and you guessed it, the largest naval battle in modern warfare. It remains the largest naval battle in modern warfare. Teddy Roosevelt gushed about Tsushima. Neither Trafalgar nor the Spanish Armada was as complete and overwhelming. Okay, so this is a seldom talked about war, the Russo-Japanese War, but it had tremendous significance and was a major factor in the planning for the attack on Pearl Harbor 37 years later, in the winter, just like this, on a Sunday morning, just like this. The parallels are rather amazing. And there was a Roosevelt president in both, during both. Teddy in the first one, Franklin in the second one. Okay? So here's some more information. Began on a Sunday morning, plotted by Teddy Roosevelt. It was planned by Admiral Hayashiro Togo. Now, this is significant because his chief junior officer was a guy named Yamamoto. Okay? Now, those of you who know anything about the attack on Pearl Harbor know that the Japanese admiral who planned the attack at Pearl Harbor 37 years later was a guy named Yamamoto, this guy. Okay? So he was there, and he saw how it worked, and it worked well. And this is an example of history repeating itself. Okay? The Russians lost the war. The Treaty of Portsmouth, as in New Hampshire, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, ended the war. It was arranged by Teddy Roosevelt, and because of that, he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1905. Another thing people really don't understand. But the key thing here, I think, on this page is to recognize that Yamamoto, the future head of the Japanese Imperial Navy in World War II, was present at this. He saw what happened, and he basically duplicated it. Okay, so here's a map. You can see Japan on the right. You see where Honshu is. And then you see Korea on the left, up in the middle part of the screen. And in that strait, that's called the Tsushima Strait. And this is where the surprise attack occurred in February of 1905. And you can see the X down there near Kyushu, the Russian Baltic Fleet. Okay? All right, so here's Togo. He's called the Admiral Nelson of Japan. He won the first great naval battle of the 20th century, and it remains the largest naval battle of the 20th century. There were 20th centuries gone by, there could be no more. He annihilated the Russian sea power in the Pacific. He imbued the IJN, which is the Imperial Japanese Navy, with unshakable belief in its indomitability. It was the first great victory of the East over the West. And once again, This guy was Yamamoto's mentor. The Russo-Japanese War changed Japanese history. Intense national pride over the victory swept the country. They had been feeling inferior to the West for a long time. Monuments to the war sprung up everywhere. It was the desire to repeat this kind of victory that drove the decision to attack Pearl Harbor 37 years later. Pearl Harbor was the second coming of the attack on Port Arthur in 1904, something that a lot of people really have never heard of, because after all, who studies the Russo-Japanese War in high school or college? The answer to that is very few, if anybody. Okay? Now, here's the captain, Mervyn Benyon, the skipper of the West Virginia, big battleship that was anchored in at Pearl on the day of the attack. Here's what he said. This is certainly in keeping with their history of surprise attacks. This was not new. This was not something that other people, didn't suspect would happen. This guy knew. This is what their MO is. All right, in 1932, there's Billy Mitchell right there. Now, Billy Mitchell, in case you don't know, was single-handedly the guy who said in the early 1920s, following World War I, that the future of war, the key element will be air power. And he spent his whole career trying to prove the truth of that statement. And there was a lot of truth in that statement, let's face it. He wrote a book in 1932. It was called Pioneer of Air Power. And here's what he said there. The Japanese never declare war before attacking. He said this in 1932. Who was listening? Well, nobody was paying attention. Okay? How about the Battle of Taranto? Not in Canada. Notice the A after the T. Taranto is in Italy on the 11th and 12th of November of 1940, more than a year before Pearl got attacked. It was between British and Italian navies. There were 2 attack waves. And guess what? Pearl Harbor, 2 attack waves. And there was a shallow harbor at Taranto. Well, guess what? Pearl Harbor was a very shallow harbor, and the Japanese had to modify their torpedoes and put wooden fins on them so they wouldn't sink too deep when they dropped them out of the plane. British Admiral Andrew Cunningham on its significance on the attack on Taranto. Taranto on the night of 11-12 November 1940 should be remembered forever as having shown that in the fleet air arm, the Navy has its most devastating weapon. And boy, did that prove to be true, particularly in the Pacific, when you consider the aircraft carriers and how the aircraft carriers dominated warfare throughout World War II. This is the first time in history that there was an all-aircraft ship-to-ship attack. First time, okay? So this is significant. And then once again, this is more than a year before Pearl Harbor. So, there's evidence out there. In case you're wondering where Taranto is, there's a blue arrow that shows you it's in the heel of the boot of Italy, okay? That's where this took place. And there's an example of the British torpedo biplane. You can see it carrying a torpedo. This is the plane that the British used. And over on the right, you see the arrows showing the angle of attack. Very similar, by the way, as you'll see, to the attack pattern of the 2 waves of planes that attacked Pearl Harbor just over a year later. Okay, there is the Type 91 Japanese torpedo, aerial torpedo affixed to the bottom of an airplane, not a biplane. They didn't use biplanes for the Pearl Harbor attack. It's about 18 inches wide and about 17 feet long. The unique characteristic of it, it had wooden fins that shed upon impact. That's the lesson that was learned from the Taranto attack. If you have a shallow harbor, you need to have wooden fins to help keep it buoyant enough to be able to do its job. Okay, the explosive warhead on the Type 91 was up to 1,160 pounds, very deadly. In fact, at Pearl, One of these torpedoes ripped a hole in the battleship Nevada, 45 feet long and 30 feet high. That's a big hole for one torpedo, okay? And here's Yamamoto, okay? Lieutenant Commander Takashi Naito was dispatched from Berlin, Germany, to study the attack on Toronto. He was there to study it for Yamamoto, who used his information a year and a month later. Naito discusses the attack with Mitsuo Fukita, leader of the Pearl Harbor attack. Fukita talked to Yamamoto. Yamamoto said, quote, "We can run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that I have utterly no confidence." You know, another famous quote from Yamamoto, who, by the way, had studied in the United States and knew English. He said he was wary about attacking the United States. He said, "We have awakened a sleeping giant." Another famous quote. So there was deception going on in 1941. And here is Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, a guy from Kentucky. That's him on the left. And you see him on the right. He's rather tall. He's like 6'3", and which in those days was huge. And there he is, to his right, the much smaller man is one of the Japanese diplomats that he had been negotiating with. And they had been doing this for, a few months, trying to establish peace between the two nations. But as it turns out, that diplomatic presence in Washington by the Japanese was just a ruse, okay, to make them think that, we were proceeding toward peace. So what the Japanese said, they said this: both the United States and Great Britain have resorted to every possible measure to assist the Chungking regime so as to obstruct the establishment of a general peace between Japan and China. These countries have strengthened their military preparations, perfecting an encirclement of Japan, these countries meaning the United States and Great Britain, and have brought about a situation which endangers the very existence of the empire. So they sent a message on Pearl Harbor Day. Thus, the earnest hope of the Japanese government to adjust Japanese-American relations and to preserve and to promote the peace of the Pacific through cooperation with the American government has finally been lost. The Japanese government regrets to have to notify hereby the American government that in view of the attitude of the American government, it is impossible to reach an agreement through further negotiations. They said this just before the bombs started falling at Pearl. Okay? Here's a 1941 note that was found many years later in 1999 by a Japanese professor named Iguchi. He said, this is what the note said: "Our deceptive diplomacy is steadily proceeding towards success." Of this, Iguchi said, "The diary shows that the Army and Navy did not want to give any proper declaration of war, or indeed prior notice even of the termination of negotiations, and they clearly prevailed." So the whole business, the whole act of diplomacy on the part of the Japanese was a ruse that was intended to make the United States, keep them naive about an attack. All right, here's Cordell Hull on receiving the Japanese message, 2:20 in the afternoon in Washington on the 7th of December. Of course, there's a time difference of several hours between Washington, D.C. and Pearl. Pearl was several hours behind this. In all my conversations with you, the Japanese ambassador, during the last 9 months, I have never uttered one word of untruth. In all my 50 years of public service, I have never seen a document that was more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions on a scale so huge that I never imagined until today that any government on this planet was capable of uttering them. Yamamoto's perspective. Yamamoto was a robust nationalist and Japanese to the marrow of his bones. Like many Japanese at the time, he believed his people to be a chosen race, selected by a far-seeing providence. That's from page 12 in one of the more famous books about Pearl Harbor, entitled At Dawn We Slept, which is, if you're looking for a good book to read about the Pearl Harbor experience, At Dawn We Slept is really good. Okay, so here's Captain Watanabe on Yamamoto. In all games, Yamamoto loved to take chances just as he did in naval strategy. He had a gambler's heart. Here's Yamamoto over there on the right. He had a gambling mentality, just like Napoleon, who said, start something, then see what happens. And just like this guy, you recognize this guy? That's Nikita Khrushchev. You remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? He said, basically, he quoted Napoleon, start something, then let's see what happens. The big problem there is, of course, you're dealing with nuclear weapons now. Okay. So there are two other Japanese admirals who played key roles in the attack on Pearl Harbor. And this guy, Yamaguchi, was another one, and he was the most forceful advocate of the attack on Pearl of all the Japanese admirals. In fact, he advocated a third wave strike. We'll talk more about that shortly, about how significant that might have been. He led his ship just before the planes took off in singing the song of the self-sacrificing warrior, a song that was based on the Port Arthur attack of 1904. So here we go again. We're back to the Russo-Japanese War. There's more. He was killed at Midway, by the way, 6 months later. Okay, so here's Plan Z. It was formulated by Yamamoto in January 41. This is 11 months. This is the plan. Plan Z was to attack Pearl Harbor. Started formulating it 11 months before the actual attack. It was controversial within the Imperial Japanese Navy. Some people forcefully advocated for it. Some were not so sure. The orders for planning and training occurred in August of 41. They practiced in Japan in harbors of modifying their torpedoes by putting wooden fins on them to test out to see what was the best way that they would float shallow enough to work in a shallow harbor like at Pearl. There were orders for 6 large fleet aircraft carriers to participate in this. 6 carriers. The pilots were the most experienced in the world at the time. How come? Because they had been fighting a war with China since 1936 or 37, these people. So they had lots of combat experience. All right, so here's the Z flag. The plan Z had a flag. And this is important too. It says the carrier turned to port and headed into the northerly wind. The battle flag was now added to the Z flag flying at the masthead. On the flight deck, a green lamp was waved in a circle to signal takeoff. These are the Japanese flyers taking off to attack Pearl. Okay? Everyone who could be spared assembled on the deck, and on each ship the message was read to all hands. Speeches followed and cheers split the air. Then, pay attention to this now. Up the Akagi's mast, that's one of the carriers, ran the same Z flag flown by Admiral Hayachiro Togo at his great victory over the Russians in 1905. He had the same flag from 36 to 37 years before. So this was, once again, this is the backstory of the attack on Pearl. It's the second coming of the attack at Port Arthur. Okay, so these arrows point out, this is an aerial, obviously, of Pearl Harbor. On the top middle, just to the right of the blue arrow at the top of the screen, you can see the channel that is the entrance channel for ships coming in from the Pacific to get into Pearl. The arrow going horizontally points at what was called Battleship Row. That's where the big ships, including the Arizona and the Nevada, were anchored. Okay, so of course the Arizona was sunk, and if you've been to Pearl Harbor, you know what I'm talking about. The ship is underwater. You can see the top of the turrets of the guns. The guns were removed, and placed on in Nevada. I'll tell you more about that later. And Hickam Field is over there on the left, an airfield. You know, so this is the area that they attacked. There's an arrow. This is significant. Look at this blue arrow pointing downward, and you see a bunch of white circles in a row. Those are fuel tanks, oil tanks. They contained an estimated 450 million gallons of fuel that powered the United States Navy. Okay, so the third wave, which never occurred, was supposed to attack those. The point is that if you had just taken those out and left the battleships alone, you would have been better off. They can't go anywhere without fuel. More about that soon. Okay, and you know, now they have an underground fuel supply, Red Hill, which is controversial in recent years because there have been leakages into the water, the drinking water, and there have been a number of naval personnel and their families that have been adversely affected by this. Okay, so there's the Arizona. That's the modern aerial view. In the top right, that's the battleship Missouri, which is anchored there. And if you went to Pearl, you probably went on board. The significance of the Missouri is that it was the ship that was used to sign the peace treaty in Tokyo Harbor in September of 1945. Okay? The Japanese military was obsessed with oil. They didn't have any in Japan. The Japanese admiral said if there were no supply of oil, battleships and any other warships would be nothing more than scarecrows. On the 5th of September of 41, Japanese military said to Hirohito, the emperor, at present, oil is the weak point of our empire's national strength and fighting power. As time passes, our capacity to carry on war will decline and our empire will become powerless militarily. Prior to 41, Japan got 80% of its oil from the United States. They invaded Southeast Asia to obtain oil in December of 41. The attack on Pearl was intended to prevent the USA from disrupting that objective. Americans, British, Dutch imposed an oil embargo on Japan, the ABCD powers, American, British, Dutch. Japan feels encircled, and so that's why they struck. They miscalculated, however, the effect on American morale. They thought that the Americans were basically lazy people and wouldn't do much or go to war with them, and they were superior racially and all the rest of that. But of course, huge miscalculation. So here are some of the oil tanks. This is a contemporary aerial picture of, you know, it was in a book that I had. That's what it looked like at Pearl Harbor. The storage tanks near Hickam Field held 450 million gallons of fuel. The Japanese had planned a third attack wave, but the plan was abandoned. The attack at Pearl was over by 9:45 in the morning local time, started just around 8 o'clock. Many believe with such an attack, war would be prolonged for 2 more years because those ships could go nowhere without oil. Here's what Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, the head of the United States Navy forces in the Pacific, said. He said this in 1958, by the way. The consequences of the Japanese attack could very easily have been devastatingly greater. The object of the Japanese attack was to inflict sufficient damage to give their navy a free hand to expand and consolidate its holdings. For this purpose, they could have chosen better targets at Pearl Harbor, the destruction of its fuel. But they didn't. This is interesting. I have never read anywhere else. I discovered this on my own, as far as I know. Here's Yamamoto on the left, and on the right, we see Nimitz. He's the head of the Japanese Navy in the Pacific. He's the head of the American Navy. Both of them are missing fingers on their left hand. Now, Yamamoto always had that. Any picture of him, he had it colored so you couldn't see the missing finger on his hand. But But you can see the ring finger is missing on Nimitz's left hand. So both, I mean, what are the odds of this happening? The two heads of both navies both are missing the same finger on the left hand. I mean, very unbelievable. Okay. There's a Nimitz Museum in Texas, and if you ever go down there, that's where he was from. He was from Texas. It is listed, by the way, in the top 10 of all museums in the United States. People who go there marvel at it. So if you ever get a chance to go to the National Museum of the Pacific in Admiral Nimitz's hometown, it might be worthwhile. Okay, more evidence that, you know, the attack on Pearl wasn't as big of a surprise as it's made out to be. Here's a warning from the Peruvian embassy that was dated January 27th, 1941, 11 months before the attack on Pearl. Sent to the U.S. Ambassador Joseph C. Grew. Quote, the Peruvian minister has informed a member of my staff that he has heard from many sources that in the event of trouble breaking out between the U.S. and Japan, the Japanese intend to make a surprise attack against Pearl Harbor with all their strength. That's 11 months ahead. Division of Navy Intelligence places no credence in these rumors. Furthermore, based on known data regarding the present disposition and deployment of Japanese naval and army forces, no move against Pearl appears imminent or planned for the future. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Okay. They had 30 ships in their strike force, 6 carriers, 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, 9 destroyers, 3 320-foot submarines, and 7 oil tankers to keep them moving. It's quite a large strike force, 30 ships. They are under absolute radio silence. This is their route. You can see Japan on the upper left, follow the line. They go over to the Central Pacific, and then what do? They dive almost straight down to the south to get just to the north of Oahu. That's where they launch. And then the rest of the line shows where they went later. Okay, here are the waves. You know, the second wave, 167 aircraft. Follow the red lines with the arrows, and you can see what they attacked. Fukita was the lead pilot for the attack. The objective of the day-to-day training was to fit man and plane together until each fighter pilot knew and understood his craft and could put it through the paces as a jockey manages his racehorse. Okay, that's Fukita. Here's a picture of him. Look at his face if you can. It's not the clearest picture, but between his nose and his upper lip, you'll see a toothbrush mustache. How come? He was a fan of Charlie Chaplin, as was a guy named Adolf Hitler. Hitler was a big fan of Charlie's, and he grew the same kind of mustache because of that, and so did Fukita. Here he is. He died in 1976. He was the lead pilot, coordinated the entire attack. He flew a torpedo bomber at Pearl. He was wounded at Midway 6 months later. His attack map that he carried in his jacket survived all of this, and about 12 years ago, it was auctioned for $425,000. He strongly advocated for a third wave attack on Pearl, but was overruled. And he admired Hitler. Note the toothbrush mustache. Hitler and Charlie Chaplin. Okay, so the attack began at about 8 o'clock Hawaiian time. 353 planes involved, 2 attack waves from 6 carriers. 8 American battleships were damaged, 4 were sunk, 7 were refurbished. The only one that wasn't refurbished, of course, was the Arizona. More about that shortly. 188 U.S. aircraft on the ground were destroyed, and there were over 2,400 dead Americans. Japan lost 29 aircraft, 5 midget subs, and 64 men. Pretty light casualties. A total of 21 American ships were damaged or sunk. Unfortunately for the Japanese, the 3 American aircraft carriers were not anchored at Pearl. They were out, and you can see them there, 1, 2, 3. Okay. And they were far enough away. And the reason they didn't do the third wave, the Japanese, is because they were afraid. They didn't know where the aircraft carriers were. And they thought they would come under attack because they thought that the aircraft carriers might be nearby. They got nervous about that. You can see number 1 is the Lexington, number 2 is the Enterprise, and number 3 is the Lexington. And here's a map, an aerial looking down. You can see the different ships there. The Arizona, just to the right is almost in the dead center. You can see that was Battleship Row. The Nevada, the Arizona, the West Virginia, Tennessee, and the Maryland, the Oklahoma, all right there. The first American shots of the war, of World War II, the very first shots, were taken by a guy from my hometown, Windsor Locks, Connecticut. His name was Herb Gurilli. He went to high school with my father, Windsor Locks High School. He commanded the Coastal Defense Battery in Hawaii on December 7th of 41 that fired the first American shots of the war. Here's a quote from the Windsor Locks Journal that says this: "This battery was the first unit of the entire United States Army to open fire in the present war with Japan, and the first Army unit to bring down a plane. In fact, they brought down 2. There's one of them on the left there. There's a picture of Herb right there on the right. He was a lieutenant. After he left Windsor Locks High School, he went to Bates College in Maine for a year, and then he transferred to Fordham in New York City, got a degree in science. He was also in the ROTC program, so they paid for his college, which was good because it's the middle of the Great Depression, and people didn't have money. So he owed time to them. And when the war drums began to beat in the late 30s and early 40s, the Army called him back, sent him to California, where he was trained to command an anti-aircraft artillery battery. And there he was on the day of the attack at his battle station. He hears the humming of a couple of hundred planes coming in, low altitude, big orange circles on the side of their fuselage, and carrying torpedoes and bombs. He knew what was going on, so he opened fire. He was the first American to fire a shot in World War II. He's from my hometown. Just a little extra material. His classmate was this guy, who was named Pete Lingua. You can see him in a football uniform there. He became a veterinarian later. And here's the interesting thing about him. He was a star athlete, Windsor Locks High School, in 3 sports. He attended Holy Cross, where he was a first-team All-American football player. At the time, he was 6'2", 240, which in the mid-1930s was a big, very big guy. And interestingly, during that time period, there was a tradition for the collegiate all-star, collegiate all-American football team to play the New York Giants in Yankee Stadium in an exhibition game. And he played, and he did so well that Wellington Mara, who owned the Giants, and the Mara family still owns the Giants, okay, offered him a contract. I saw a copy of it. And he got out of college in 35. One of his sons showed it to me once. He offered him a contract to play the next season for the New York Giants for the whole season, $650. Now, those guys make that in what, a minute these days? Okay, but it was interesting. But here's the thing. He went to veterinary school in Toronto. He graduated, became a vet. And look at the bottom. He took care of Patton's horses during the war, this guy. And he was a classmate of Herb Gurilli, and he went to high school with my father as well. Families were good friends. Here's I hand wrote right there on the right side, location of Gurilli's battery right there. There's a circle right there. I think there's a runway there now. I'm not sure. I got a guy checking it out this weekend who's going there. The entrance to the harbor is up here on the left. Of course, that's Oahu. And here's another harbor map. We saw that before. Here you can see where Hickam Field is right there. That's American airplanes were there. Many of them were destroyed. And you see the oil storage tanks that they should have gotten, but they didn't. Okay, this is Battleship Row. You got the West Virginia, the Tennessee, and of course, the Arizona. The problem with the Arizona is they had a lucky shot when a big bomb dropped by a Japanese plane went down right down the funnel and detonated where all the ordnance was stored in the bottom of the ship. So the secondary explosion of all the explosives stored on the ship literally lifted this battleship out of the water. And if you had a clue about how heavy this thing was, it's simply an amazing thing to contemplate how many thousands of tons of ship were literally lifted out of the water. And the hole that was blown from it, of course, sank the ship. And lots of people died. This is Wheeler Field, which was north of Hickam Field, and lots of American planes got destroyed there. One of the pilots from Connecticut was Gordon Sterling, and he got a P-36 into the air, one of the few guys that was able to get up to engage the Japanese fighters. And believe me, if you were in a P-36, you had a problem. It was probably one of the worst airplanes you could be flying at the time. Nevertheless, he engaged 6 planes, shot one down before he got shot down and killed. He got the Distinguished Flying Cross and a Purple Heart. Sterling Field in West Hartford is named for this guy. Okay, there is his Distinguished Flying Cross. I'm not going to read the whole thing. And here's an interesting story. That 1941 Buick Special you see on the right, that blue car, had just arrived in Pearl Harbor for him from California on a ship just a week or so before the attack. And he was very proud of it. It was brand new. Okay, keep in mind that from 42 to 45, Americans built no cars. So they were building Jeeps and trucks and airplanes. So what happened was on the left, you can see a frame. And if you look on the upper right above the SCO in San Francisco, you'll see a hole. That was his windshield. Japanese Zero shot some machine gun bullets and shattered his windshield. So they had that replaced and they framed this. And this car is still on the road in Connecticut these days. It was shipped back home. It's currently owned by John Mihalik of Plymouth, Connecticut, who married into the family. His 41 Buick was used in the dedication of the Pearl Harbor Memorial Highway, December 17th, 2001. That's Route I-69 between Perry and Flint, Michigan. And in parades in Connecticut, this guy will still drive this famous car. Okay? There are other Connecticut victims here. We won't go into great detail on them, but there are quite a few. John Lutna from Canton, Thomas Reeves from Thomaston. And Reeves, by the way, was one of 15 Americans to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor and one of 6 from Connecticut to receive the Medal of Honor during World War II. There's John Lutna, a picture of him from Collinsville. He was on the Nevada, which has an interesting story, which we'll get into very shortly. There it is right there. That's the USS Nevada shelling Normandy on the D-Day invasion with the 14-inch guns from the Arizona. They lifted the guns off the Arizona. That's why if you go to the Arizona, you see the top big circle of where the turrets were, the gun turrets. Well, the guns were still good, so they took them off. The Nevada's guns were not. So the guns from the Arizona are what you're looking at here, shelling Normandy on D-Day. Pretty interesting. And by the way, the captain of the Nevada was pretty clever. He got his ship underway and he deliberately grounded it in shallow water so it would be much easier to salvage. And they had it salvaged and repaired within 2 or 3 months. It went back to battle, as you can see. There's a picture of Reeves. He got the Medal of Honor. And there's a citation. I'm not going to take the time to read that. He was on the California. And that's the Punch Bowl. That's the American Military Cemetery in Oahu. I took this picture of Reeves's grave. My brother and I visited the Punch Bowl in 2011. And there's a destroyer that was named after Reeves in his honor, USS Reeves. And here's Eric Allen of Fairfield. Sad story here. He was flying an F-4 off the Enterprise, which was out at sea, and he was flying on a routine flight back to Pearl. He gets near Pearl and he sees all the shooting going on. He has no clue what is going on. He didn't know there was a Japanese attack underway. And friendly fire thought he was a Japanese guy, so he was shot down and killed by American anti-aircraft fire. And there's his stone at the punch bowl. I took that picture. And then we had victims at two airfields from Connecticut. Had a guy from Stamford, and there's Sterling. And then we had a guy from Bridgeport and Darien, and a guy from New Haven. Here's the Maryland and the Oklahoma. They were lined up right with the Arizona. Okay. If you recall some photos you may have seen about Pearl Harbor, you remember one with the battleship upside down? You see the bottom of the battleship floating? That's the Oklahoma. Okay. There it is, right there. Okay. The most difficult to salvage. It took 8 months to get it righted. This is the last Connecticut guy, Floyd Welch of East Lyme, the last one Pearl Harbor survivor to die. He died in August of 2020. He served aboard the Maryland at Pearl, and he, along with a bunch of other guys, with that ship upside down in the harbor, there were guys crawling on that with cutting torches, and they heard guys inside making noise, and they'd cut holes to try to help them out, and they did save some of them. That's Floyd Welch. He's the last known Connecticut Pearl Harbor survivor. He died about 5 years ago. Okay, this is the story about brothers, Harold and William Trapp. They were killed in action on the Oklahoma. They were unidentified initially and placed in mass graves. DNA was used to ID them. They're from LaPorte, Indiana, and they were brought back home. I mention this because there's statistics about the number of brothers who were killed just on the Arizona alone, 23 sets of brothers in one set of triplets. Twins, you know, a lot of twins. Okay, so the West Virginia was in line in Battleship Row along with the Arizona and the Maryland, and it was struck by 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs. The oil fire raged for 30 hours. Captain Mervyn Benyon, I quoted him before about him knowing the Japanese always did sneak attacks, counter-flooded the starboard side so it would go down on its keel. Navy cook Dory Miller mans a 50 caliber machine gun and downs 4 Japanese planes and gets the Navy Cross. Okay, there's the West Virginia on the left after it was so damaged, and on the right, after they rehabbed it, they had that thing up and going within 3 or 4 months. And there's Dory Miller, Waco, Texas, 6'3" football player, big, strong guy. He was a cook, and he wasn't really trained to shoot a 50 caliber machine gun, but he jumped on it when the guy firing it got killed, and he saved many lives on his ship, shot down several Japanese planes, and got the Navy Cross. Later, he was killed near the Gilbert Islands on the USS Liscum during the war. There he is. They made a poster of him. This poster is a very famous poster, and if you had an original, it's worth tens of thousands of dollars. On the right, you see Dory Miller getting the Navy Cross pinned on him by Admiral Nimitz. And if we know Dory Miller was 6'3", we can assume that so was Admiral Nimitz, quite a big guy. Okay, here's an aside. Pettipog Point is right here in Connecticut, in Essex, Connecticut. And very few people know this. On April 8th of 1814, during the War of 1812, the British torched 28 American ships right there in Essex on the Connecticut River. That's 10 more than those that were destroyed at Pearl Harbor in 41. The greatest loss of ships by the Americans was not at Pearl Harbor. It was right here in Connecticut at Pettipog Point. 28 ships. It was the single most destructive raid on American shipping in our history from 1814. Here's the Arizona. On the left, you can see it. That's the Brooklyn Bridge in the background there, I believe. And there it is over there on the right. You can see the big guns on it. This is, of course, well before what happened at Pearl Harbor. It was constructed and went to sea first in 1915. That's during World War I. There were 1,177 men on the ship that were killed, just on this one ship. That's almost half the casualties at Pearl Harbor. 2,403 casualties, almost 1,200 just on the Arizona. It was over 600 feet long, 29,000 tons, momentarily lifted out of the water, which is hard to believe, but it happened. The turret 2 guns were salvaged and mounted on the Nevada, as I said before. Okay, there were 10 Connecticut casualties on the Arizona. They're listed there, a guy from Norwich, guy from Hamden, Wallingford, Stamford, Meriden, Berlin, Bridgeport, Norwich again, New London, and at the bottom, Almont Whitehead from Hartford. We'll talk about him now. There's his name on the left. I took this picture, UI Whitehead Jr. ENS means he was an ensign. That is on the wall at the Arizona Memorial. Look onto the right picture, you see it says Whitehead Highway. Well, where is that? Ever go up 91 and get off the Capitol area exit? Go under the Hartford Public Library to the Bushnell, right? Lafayette Circle right there, Hartford Hospital over here off of Hudson Street, okay? That highway that connects the Bushnell area with 91 is called the Whitehead Highway. And by the way, another interesting fact, when you're driving on that connector called the Whitehead Highway, you are driving over a river. That highway was built over the Park River. So right below you is water flowing. But it was named after this guy who was killed on the Arizona because his dad owned a filling station, a gasoline station with car repair capabilities right where the Hartford Library is today. So they named it after him. Okay, few people realize that or even see it. Okay, here's a guy from Maryland. I have some pictures of these guys, and here's a guy, Patterson from Berlin, Connecticut. They were all killed on the Arizona. The ship's artifacts, the flag from the Arizona, you see on the left, and over there, the bell on the right. These are stored, by the way, at the university. I think it's either Arizona State or the University of Arizona. I think it's the University of Arizona, which, of course, the Arizona is the name of the ship, so it makes sense. They display them at the university. Okay, that's the superstructure that was left of the Arizona after the blast. Of course, that was removed. All right, and there you see on the right the turret from turret number 2. That's where the guns were taken off, and they were reused on the Nevada. Okay, and there's the Missouri off to the left, the Arizona Memorial to the right at Pearl. Okay, a couple more pictures of the memorial. You can see people standing on the right inside of it. Okay, that's the interior of the Arizona Memorial. I took that picture. And the Admiral's bridge clock was salvaged. There's an aerial view of the Arizona on the right. And that is on the wall in the Arizona. That's where I took the picture of Whitehead's name there, alphabetized listing of the 1,177 Americans who were killed just on that ship. Okay, so 38 sets of brothers on the Arizona, including 3 sets of 3 brothers. 63 of those 79 brothers died. Thomas and William Free of Texas died, father and son. And there were 3 sets of 3 brothers, the Beckers, the Dohertys, and the Murdochs. 1 from each set survived, just on the Arizona. And there they are, 1 guy from groups of 3. Okay, so Seaman First Class William V. Ball of Iowa was killed in action. And there's a picture of the 5 Sullivan brothers. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of the Sullivan brothers. They were killed near Guadalcanal on USS Juneau. They all were serving on the same ship. They all were from Iowa, and they all died. They made a movie about this, okay? It got a lot of notoriety, a lot of play in the newspapers back home. And of course, they started what was called the Sullivan Rule, which meant that because of the tragedy of one family losing so many of its people, they separated people and they would only allow a certain number of members of one family into conflict at any time. That was known as the Sullivan Rule, to try to minimize the heartbreaking effect of losing everybody. But I bring this up because the reason that these guys joined the Navy together is because their one sister was engaged to a guy on the Arizona who was killed by the Japanese. So they decided as a group to avenge their sister was engaged to this guy, the fiance of their sister, and that's what motivated them to join. And then, of course, they all get killed, deepening the tragedy for the family in Iowa. So here's a book by Walter Bornemann called Brothers Down. It's a 2019 book regarding the story. It's quite a poignant book of all the different brothers that were on the Arizona. It's really rather remarkable to understand just how many there were. 79. Okay. Here's the story of Joe George. He was 26 years old. He was on the Vestal, which was on Battleship Row. He disobeyed the order to cut the line to the Arizona after seeing 6 men on its deck. He had this unbelievable, I don't know, maybe adrenaline motivated him. He had a Herculean throw of rope to the Arizona. He tied it off, and all 6 of those guys on the deck of the Arizona climbed over from the Arizona to his ship, the Vestal, and he saved their lives. It's quite a story. There are 2 of the survivors right there who came over on the rope that he threw. Okay, and I'm not going to read all of this, but it's by one of these guys that came over on the rope. It says at the bottom, "We all made it across the line because of the bravery of Seaman Joe George. He was never awarded anything for his bravery, and going against the direct order from his captain who wanted to pull away from the Arizona and leave us all to die. He's no longer with us, but I believe his widow and his memory should be awarded the Navy Cross." Now, those are Navy frogmen. What are they doing? They're putting ashes at the site of the Arizona. 44 of the 334 survivors on the Arizona, after they died, they had their ashes interred in the ship, and the Navy does that for free. Here's the punch bowl I mentioned before. You may have seen that picture on the right if you're a fan of Hawaii Five-0 from years ago. That was one of the pictures in the opening scene. Okay, many of the Pearl Harbor guys were buried there. Many of them were listed as unknown because they were burned so badly you couldn't recognize them. Here's the Pearl Harbor Bridge, Memorial Bridge, sometimes simply called the Q Bridge in New Haven. Technically, it's the Pearl Harbor Memorial Bridge, and they light up all those lights on Pearl Harbor Day. So there's Yamamoto again. We come back to Yamamoto. There was a plan called Operation Vengeance to assassinate this guy who was the mastermind of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And that happened in April 14th of 43. The United States intelligence decoded a message. They knew he was going to fly to the Solomon Islands and about what time. So Admiral Bull Halsey said, "Let's get the bastard." Okay, so what did they do? They sent those planes. Those are P-38s, very interesting planes, you know, they could go a long distance, and they could go real fast too. And you can look at the nose, you can see the machine guns, and they had a cannon there too. A long-range flyer could go 435 miles, flew extremely low. 12 engaged the fighter escort for Yamamoto. 4 engaged Yamamoto's planes, and they shot it down. They killed them. Okay, Yamamoto's body was found in the jungle. Had 2 bullet wounds, one to the shoulder, one to the jaw. He was cremated, and his remains were returned to Japan. He had a state funeral that over 1 million Japanese attended. Okay, so Operation Barbarossa in Pearl Harbor. This is interesting. Hitler invades Russia on June 22nd of 41. Operation Barbarossa was the name given to attacking Russia by the Germans. The winter in Europe of 41-42 was the coldest ever in the 20th century. The Germans were ill prepared for extreme cold. 137 died of hypothermia. The temperature on 12/7/41 is minus 49 degrees. That's the same day as Pearl Harbor, but in Russia, it's minus 49. Unbelievable. Okay, so the Battle of Moscow in the fall of 41, Stalin transferred over 18 divisions, that's 1,700 tanks and 1,500 aircraft from Siberia in the Far East just prior to Pearl Harbor. Did he know the Pearl Harbor attack was imminent? The transfer of all, everything that was defending the far eastern part of Russia over near Japan got transferred to save Stalingrad and to save Moscow. And there are many people who believe that Stalin knew, probably from spies, that the attack on Pearl Harbor was going to occur and that he could afford to reduce his forces over there to reinforce his Western Front. Probably true. Who knows for sure? Okay, so this is the Star Bulletin. Hawaii bombed by Japanese planes. Huge news. Jap bombs smash at Hawaii before Tokyo declares war. And it says there from the newspaper, the sly, cowardly attack executed at the very hour Japan's Machiavellian envoys were conducting peace negotiations with our government. Okay, strong patriotic reaction. Here we are, volunteers for Pearl Harbor. And then the sign at the bottom, remember Pearl Harbor, very widely used. Okay, the U.S. Army at the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor was ranked 19th in size. Spain had a bigger army than we did in 41. Well, that soon changed. Okay, so here are some posters. Okay, avenge Pearl Harbor, remember Pearl Harbor, enlist now. I want you to remember Pearl Harbor. Very powerful emotional reaction in the country. Hundreds of thousands of people enlisted. Here's FDR giving his famous Day of Infamy speech. That was the day after on Monday, December the 8th. He signs the declaration of war on his desk. Congress is supposed to be the only branch of government that can declare war. That seems to be changing. But there he is. They passed the declaration of war. One person voted against it, Jeanette Rankin of Wyoming. And in 1917, in April the 5th, when Congress declared war against Germany in World War I, one person voted against it, Jeanette Rankin from Wyoming. She has the distinction of being the only person to vote against going to war in both of our world wars. Okay, so how did we find out key information? Because just 7 months later, we had the turning point in the war at the Battle of Midway in June of 42. And these guys were responsible for it. Captain or Admiral Layton on the left and Captain Joseph Rochefort on the right. They were crypt analysts who broke the code and knew where the Japanese were going to be. And that's why Midway worked. And they were tutored by this woman, Agnes Meyer Driscoll, who deserves a whole lot more press and credit than she has ever gotten. She was a brilliant American cryptanalyst of both world wars. She was a mentor to both Layton and Rochefort. She was fluent in English, French, German, Latin, and Japanese. She enlisted in 1918, remained the leading Navy cryptanalyst through 1949. She's the one who really was principally responsible for us breaking the code of the Japanese and enabling our forces to win at Midway. Okay, well, we're getting near the end here. The World War I connection. This is another thing that is seldom talked about. Japan benefits from the 1919 Treaty of Versailles. Japan joins the Allies against Germany in World War I. Now, a lot of people don't know that. The Germans had extensive holdings in the Pacific, and they were given to the Japanese in the Treaty of Versailles. That included Shandong province in China, the Marshall, Marianas, and Caroline Islands, and this whetted the imperialistic appetite of Japan's warlords. They benefited from the Treaty of Versailles. The Japanese disappointment in the treaty was they saw control of all of China, not just a piece of it, as the treaty gave them. They wanted a statement regarding the equality of all races included in the treaty, still suffering the old inferiority complex against the West. They didn't get that, and that irritated them. Okay? Walter Short, appointed U.S. military commander of the defense of Hawaii in February of 41. He's obsessed with the defense against local sabotage, as 130,000 Hawaiians at the time were of Japanese extraction. He herded the planes together for defense against sabotage, and of course that enabled the Japanese to more effectively destroy them when they attacked the two airfields. Okay, here's Husband Kimmel, the only human being I ever knew or heard of whose first name was Husband. Okay, he was born in 1882, died in 68. He was a Kentucky native. He was viewed by many as the scapegoat for the attack on Pearl. He was reduced in rank and retired. He was transferred to Groton, Connecticut. In the 2000 defense bill 25 years ago, he spent the rest of his life trying to recoup his reputation. And to a large extent, most people now believe he was not the guy principally responsible for the attack at Pearl. They had to blame someone. He got the blame. Okay? The defense bill said that he was not provided necessary and critical intelligence that would have alerted them to prepare for the attack. So he's a little bit off the hook. Okay? Here's May 14th of 68. This is from the Hartford Courant, when he died, the guy blamed for Pearl Harbor. His reputation has been somewhat rehabilitated. He had a son named Manning Kimmel. His father's name, Admiral Kimmel's father's name was Manning, by the way. Kid was named after him. He was the commander of the USS Robalo, it's a submarine, sunk off the Philippines, struck a mine but survived, reportedly killed in a POW camp retaliation. Several descendants still bear the name Manning Kimmel. So his son was killed in the war. Okay, let me just go here, and then I'll come back to the other one. I have them a little out of order. You see 205 Ledyard Street in New London, Connecticut on the left, that gray house with the steep roof. That is the house that Admiral Kimmel lived in when he was transferred back to Groton following his demotion after Pearl Harbor. On the right, you see it's a yellow house there, okay? That's 203 Ledyard Street. Interesting, because that's where my wife grew up. That was my mother-in-law and father-in-law's house right there, right next door to Admiral Kimmel. Now I'll go back here. This is the last slide. Okay, just a few days ago, this book came out. Maybe today you heard a story about this book on NPR, as I did, Family of Spies. The author is Christine Kuehn, Kuehn. On the right, you see her grandparents. Their last name is Kuehn, from Germany. They were spies sent by the Germans to go to Hawaii to spy for the Japanese and to pass on information to the Japanese about Pearl Harbor and when they should attack and where they should go. So this was hidden from the future generations of this family, including her. These are her grandparents, and she didn't have a clue about it. Turns out she had an aunt, the sister of her grandfather, who had an affair with Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister back in Germany. Okay? So didn't have a clue about any of this until about 1994. Then one thing led to another, and a cascade of information came down to reveal the infamous role her own family had in the attack on Pearl Harbor. So if you're interested in tracking down the latest book about what happened at Pearl Harbor, this might be a good Christmas gift for somebody right here. It just came out just a few days ago, Family of Spies. So that's all I got, you know? I mean, I think it's pretty cool that my wife's house It's right next to Kimmel's house. But there's so many different things about the attack on Pearl Harbor that people don't know, particularly the importance of understanding the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War and how Yamamoto participated in that. And he saw what a sneak attack could do to destroy the Russian fleet as it did. And that was just reenacted 37 years later. Okay, most people don't have a clue about that. And it was on a Sunday morning. It was in the winter. It was a sneak attack. Sound familiar? Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And then, of course, there were all kinds of information and signs that it wasn't as much of a surprise as most people believe it was. There's plenty of evidence to see that something bad might happen. And that was pretty much ignored. So they blamed Kimmel. And there are other people really who were more responsible for not having them prepared. Now, any of those of you who are here, if you have any questions or comments, I'd be happy to entertain them at this point, because that's about all I got. Or if anybody online wants to type in a question, Helen can read it to me. Anything? Oh, thank you. I hope you learned something. It's quite an interesting story. And there's a lot of different other stories out there that are vastly underpublicized that should be known.